As I'm doing a rapid survey of New Testament, I'm going into more detail on some books than on others. For Colossians, I'm going to give a super brief introduction. There are disagreements regarding the authorship of Colossians. I believe it was written by Paul. I think the style is not very different from Paul's earlier letters compared to some other kinds of things. Also, this letter is written to Colossae, and it wouldn't make sense to write to Colossae after Colossae was destroyed in an earthquake, which happened somewhere around the year 60 or 62. Paul's time of writing was presumably before that. After that, nobody would make up such a letter. Paul probably died around the year 64 or 65, so chances are it goes back to Paul. The false teaching that's addressed in the letter, well, he speaks of philosophy. Philosophy was very popular among Greeks and also very popular among Hellenistic Jewish intellectuals in Asia Minor. The particular kind of philosophy that he's addressing, it's not like all kinds of philosophy, but it's definitely human philosophy. He says it has some Jewish elements. So he speaks of new moons and Sabbaths in 2:16. It's definitely Jewish. Worship of or with angels, that's sometimes debated in 2:18. Not sure if with angels would be a problem, but possibly talking about visions in 2:18. We know from 2 Corinthians, Paul has visions himself, but these people are appealing to things they've seen, maybe apocalyptic type visions or Jewish mysticism. Again, Paul himself is Jewish, so it's not against everything Jewish, but it's against what certain people are teaching. His solution is focus on Jesus. You can't go wrong with that. Focus on Christ. And he describes Christ in the first chapter in terms that were used by other Jewish teachers to describe divine wisdom or the Logos. Divine wisdom, you read about it in Proverbs chapter 8, and you read about it in other ancient Jewish sources. Philo of Alexandria, who was a very popular Jewish philosopher at the time, also had talked a lot about the Logos as kind of a way of God revealing himself in the world. So Paul takes over some of the language that was like the closest he could get to speaking of God without identifying Jesus with God the Father. So in other words, Jesus is divine, but he's not God the Father. So he goes on to speak of how the fullness of deity is in Jesus, and it's in him that believers are complete. We don't need to add something to Jesus. Jesus is the fullness of deity, so if we want to approach God, we do so through Jesus. He also speaks of Jesus being the focus of heavenly vision. So Jewish apocalypses, they focused on trying to envision God's throne. Well, Paul looks at God's throne, and what does he see there? Jesus, enthroned at the right hand of the Father. Again, Jesus is the way to the Father. Jesus is the perfect image of the Father, like some Jewish people said in Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7. And Greeks also, some Greek philosophers tried to meditate on heavenly things, and they thought that meditating on heavenly things, they would meditate on pure, emotionless, rational intellect. But that's not what Paul sees in the heavens. He sees a God who cares for us and sent his own son, Jesus, to reconcile us to himself by Jesus' death and resurrection. He also goes on to speak of the moral implications of our union with Christ in the rest of chapter 3 and the beginning of chapter 4. Now, we already talked about in the lecture on Ephesians some of the household codes that follow and why Paul would speak about them in the particular setting that he's in. He's writing from Roman custody. He knows one of the things Romans are very concerned about these religious views coming from the Eastern Mediterranean, a number of other groups, as well as Christians. They considered these people subverting traditional Roman family values. So he shows where Christians actually agree with those values and also where they need to be adjusted some, not least in talking about how masters need to care for their servants as basically their equals, the way that Paul uses the language. So here's a very rapid survey of Colossians. And the bottom line is kind of the bottom line of the New Testament. Jesus is where it's at. It's all about Jesus.